Hello everyone. In today's video, I'm going to show you the only opening you will ever need, the Pirc or King's Indian Defense. The reason it is the only opening you will ever need is that you can play it with the white pieces, you can play with the black pieces, and if you have the black pieces or the white pieces, no matter what your opponent does, whether it be e4, d4, c4, knight to f3, you are going to play the exact same stuff and have the exact same opening. And it also requires a minimal theory compared to every single other opening out there. Let's get into it. Alright, so today I'm going to be showing you specifically the Pirc Defense, which is pawn to e4, and you might be able to hear some thunder outside, pawn to e4, and now pawn to d6. This formation here is the Pirc Defense. However, if they play pawn to d4, then it is now the King's Indian Defense, and if we play it from the white pieces, then it is now the King's Indian Attack. However, it really is all the same stuff with minimal differences between each variation. So e4 and d6. And the main idea of the Pirc Defense is to play pawn to g6 and develop our bishop, our fianchetto it, develop our knight out, and then castle, and just have a very solid position. And eventually to end up pushing our f-pawn and jam it all the way up to white's throat, and eventually, even in some variations, all the way up to f3 and go on a king's side attack. So what white will almost do here is, because we don't claim a space in the center that much, they're going to take even more space, pawn to d4, and now we play knight to f6. This move attacks our e-pawn, and a lot of people here actually will just not defend it, and if they don't, then we will obviously just take it. But here we already have a trap. White here might try to jam their pawn forward with the move pawn to e5. Pawn to e5. And if they play this, then this is actually a mistake that just loses a pawn. The reason it loses a pawn is that we will take it, they will take back, and now we actually trade queens first, because this trade here opened up our paths between the queens. So, oh my, I cannot get this theory straight. So, take, we'll trade queens first, and after they take, now you play this move, knight to g4. And this move is simply a fork of their f2 pawn, which would be a fork of the rook and king. Obviously, they cannot allow that, but also their overextended e-pawn. So what they're most likely to do is to play something like bishop to e3 to defend this, at which point we'll simply take their e-pawn and we're just up a pawn. And some people here will just not see that we're threatening this and simply play knight to f3 to defend it. And if they do this, then we'll simply get this fork and just win a ton of material and be completely winning. So they can't lunge forward with pawn to e5, but they still need to defend this. They will likely play knight to c3. If instead they play something like bishop to d3 to defend, then once again you have all the same ideas. It almost never matters what white actually plays here. So, knight to c3, and now you play pawn to g6, and like I said, we're following through with this plan, bishop to g7, and castle. So they'll play knight to f3, bishop g7, they'll develop their bishop, and now we castle. They will castle back. Now, this move pawn to e5 for them is actually a threat now, where before they would have to take their king, now they can just take their rook after all the trades happen. So because of that, that would actually be bad for us. And we can't directly prevent this move. One of the best ways to do it indirectly is actually play bishop to g4 and pin their knight to their queen, and their knight is one of the main defenders here. And the important thing to remember here is that after they play this move pawn to h3, attacking our bishop, usually we would want to drop back to h5 and retain this pin. However, here they can simply play pawn to g4 and just trap our bishop. So here we will actually just trade knights, or trade our bishop for their knight. And the reason this is actually good, whereas most of the time it's not, is that here now we have this move knight to c6, and this queen on the square isn't really giving them any advantages. The only thing that's really doing is actually a target for the future when we play pawn to f5 and pawn to f4. And the other reason we play knight to c6 is to support the e5 push ourselves. And the reason we cannot do this with the rook, like rook to e8, is that now they have this move pawn to e5. And after takes, now we would have to move our knight away, and they would get bishop takes on f7, and end up just winning our rook. So they still have to defend this d-pawn here. So they will likely play bishop to e3 to defend it, at which point now we strike in the center, pawn to e5. And now they have an option here. If they take it, then we'll simply take back with our knight, and now we get a fork of their queen and bishop, So after they drop their queen back to protect it, we will simply take it. After they take back, this is just a good position for us, and the engine says we have completely equalized here. So instead, they're going to play this move pawn to d5. Now if they play this, we are actually just going to drop our knight back. And the reason we do this is that White's main plan here is to play pawn to a4 and start grabbing a ton of space on the queen side, pawn to b4, here and here. However, our plan is to actually bring our other knight back. This kind of looks stupid, however, has a very straightforward idea. After they keep grabbing space, we're going to rush in the center with pawn to f5. If they take it, then we'll simply take back with our knight, and now we have this x-ray against our queen if we ever move the knight, and the engine says that trading for this bishop actually is going to be fantastic for us, so that's just good for us. Big thunder outside. And the other thing they can do is if they see that our rook is x-raying their queen, they try to get it out of here, then now we play this move pawn to f4 instead of trading it here. We play pawn to f4 and we jam it down White's throat. We're attacking their bishop. Their bishop has to drop back to b2 or to c1 and just be extremely passive. And our plan here is to attack this king. And to do that, we're going to play g5 and h6. We're going to move our knight behind. We're going to move our queen out and eventually end up stacking our rooks on this f-file here and push to f3 with our pawn. And if they play something else, like instead of pawn to e4, pawn to d4, or pawn to c4, knight to f3, then we have all the same ideas. We're going to play knight to f6, they'll play pawn to c4, and now pawn to g6, knight to c3, bishop to g7. And if you're wondering, we only play this move pawn to d6 when we have to, and when we have to is when they push this e-pawn up and are threatening to go to e5. And here we have all the same ideas. We're going to castle, maybe pin this knight, knight to c6, and eventually a pawn to e5 push. Or in this position, you can also go to eventually pawn to c5 push if you want to. But either you do either of those, then you will eventually push your f-pawn up and try to go on a kingside attack if they end up castling. And once again, we can also play it from the white side, like g3, and if they played now pawn to d5, then knight to f3, bishop g2, and now once again pawn to d3. We're doing the exact same setup, just mirrored on this side, and we have all the exact same ideas. It's just a little better for us this time because we are also up a tempo. So that is everything you need to know to play the Pirc Defense or King's Indian Defense or King's Indian Attack, whatever you want to call it. But thank you for watching. I hope you have a great day, and I will see you next time.